We have an infestation on our hands.
What are you talking about?
It's cars. Today on Bike Banter, we're going to be talking a little bit about how we got here. We have some of the worst traffic here in Toronto, in North America, and some of the worst in the world. My name's Owen.
And I'm Veronica.
And we're going to talk, a little bit about the history and kind of how public opinion has shifted and changed. This is kind of a discussion piece. It's kind of, we want to hear your comments. So if you want to get engaged in the discussion, please feel free to comment on the video and let us know what you think. So kind of some of the discussions we've been having at the shop is kind of about micromobility. It's something we kind of think about often, like bikes, pedelec bikes, electric assist bikes, cargo bikes, scooters, monowheels. All those things are this kind of new wave of mobility solutions we're seeing. And I kind of see this as very much a renaissance, similar to what we saw in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where people were just inventing new ways to get around. And obviously with technology, we have a lot more possibilities now for what is available to us. The kind of sticking point, though, is most of these things are not actually legal in Toronto. We've decided they are against having, against accessibility for folks maybe using mobility devices by necessity, not by choice.
Or I think it is more that people are... It is, because it's so new, people are choosing to not regulate because it's they want to see what happens with it, I guess.
Yeah,
or, I don't know. Are they waiting for something to happen?
Well, technically, we haven't waited. Toronto has been against it officially. We have.
Or how the e-scooters are not street legal, but they are also not enforcing that, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of non-enforcement period, which is another point entirely. We just won't take into too deep. But I think what's kind of, one thing we talk about a lot is car alternatives and how to kind of get around simply. And I think where this falls a lot, and the kind of brunt of the weight falls on cargo bikes and electric cargo bikes. So part of the framing here is we were talking about jaywalking and how jaywalking is kind of a myth. It's not really a thing. It was a campaign against basically people existing in public spaces and an attempt for cars to kind of take over. And this is kind of what motivated me to look into more history around car and just, we'll call it motor vehicle travel on roads. And this is, there's a few different instances we're going to be looking at, not just specific to Canada, some in the US, some in the UK. And I think it's a funny spot to start, but it's what we call Locomotive Acts. So the UK was pretty on top of trying to mandate and control basically motor vehicle travel. And before we had the term car, we were looking at Locomotive Acts. So what a Locomotive Act was is basically a set of guidelines, and there was concerns from the public around pollution, around noise, around just basically the danger it poses to everyone around. So what we have here, we have a couple instances and little kind of rules for Locomotive Acts. So for context, some of these early types of vehicles were just starting around just after 1800. And the Locomotive Acts, there was a series of acts that were constantly being reviewed.
Let's contextualize the vehicles a little bit.
Yeah, true. True, yeah. We should.
So these aren't just the carriages that you may have envisioned leading directly into cars. These are basically steam engines that were rail-free steam engines.
Well, some of the earliest examples were. I think there was kind of a shift, but we have some
but I don't
footage.
want it to be horse and buggy. Direct straight line to car.
We have some footage we'll be showing right now of kind of what some of these early attempts at horseless carriages, or the one we have is called the Puffing Devil, which I believe is cited as the earliest example of a locomotive, a road locomotive is I think the way they called it.
And these things are colossal. Even by our standards now where we have trucks, these things are huge. But we also have to contextualize it in the narrowness of their streets. So these things were even bigger in comparison.
And also seemed quite unwieldy to control. Not nearly the same kind of safety standards we have now. They were, frankly, kind of experimental for the day. And they were cool, but also did not seem the most practical with some of these early attempts. So we're going to start with some of the ideas from the Locomotive Act of 1861. So the number one thing I pulled out here was that the vehicle consumed its own smoke, which I thought was interesting because they're already concerned with literally just polluting the streets. Because, we see as cars, some people see cars as like a solution to get away from horse poo, right?
Yeah.
And we're like, less poo in a congested city, less resources towards that made kind of sense, but they were still concerned with consume its own smoke. We also had legality and basically accountability concerns. Requirement for the owner's name and the weight of the vehicle to be clearly displayed on the vehicle, and a speed limit of 10 miles per hour on open road or 5 miles per hour in the city.
That is also interesting. It's like having your license and registration on the outside instead, right?
Yeah, and I'm actually kind of surprised because I do see when I'm like, especially when you're biking around, you pass a small bridge, there's lots of stipulations of that, and I'm kind of surprised more like
with regards to vehicle weight.
Yeah, like limit 4 tons, and then even like bridge heights. And I'm a little surprised that more vehicles don't just have that listed, especially when it's commercial.
Right. You think all the information should be on the outside?
Well, yeah, some of it, because like clearly I've seen personally many instances of cars hitting bridges. I used to live near a bridge, and it was one of the underpass ones that go onto the tracks that flood all the time, and people would always underestimate the height of their vehicles, and they just, give their truck a little haircut or their box van a little shave.
Yeah, I think everyone has the right to privacy, anonymity, whatever, but you should also be accountable for stuff. Like, hit and runs will be a lot harder with that.
Yeah, that's true, especially with the amount of cameras we have available to us publicly.
I mean, we don't want to be surveilling people.
So 4 years later, they amended this Locomotive Act, and this is a little more better known because this is referred to the Locomotive Act as 1865, which is also called the Red Flag Act. And this is clearly they're being even more conservative because there's clearly been advancements and things are still too fast. That 10 and 5 mile per hour limit was too fast. So they actually changed it down to a 4 mile per hour limit and 2 miles per hour in town. So this is in the UK. And this is where the red flag name comes. A man with a red flag was to walk at least 60 yards or 55 meters while any locomotive is in motion, and shall carry a red flag constantly displayed, and shall warn the riders of drivers of horses of the approach of such locomotives, and shall signal the driver thereof when it shall be necessary to stop, and shall assist horses and carriages drawn by horses passing the same.
We need those for the SUVs, the Suburban. Man with a flag.
But again, it's like it's just like we treat construction signals, right? It's like you have a construction site, you need a team flagging, navigating traffic, and that's basically how they treated it.
You need to indicate that there's construction site at least a block in advance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Show if there's a lane closure, you need someone allowing traffic if there's a closed lane with your stop and slow.
I just saw the construction that they started on Harvard this morning, and it's like very chaotic there.
Absolutely.
You're switching around.
There's issues. There's always issues. But I think it's interesting to think every single locomotive on the road at that time required this. So you'd have minimum 2, maybe 3 people just helping navigate any of these vehicles. And then again, this is in the 1865. Vehicles were required to have functional lights and not sound whistles off or blow off steam while on the road. So they're concerned again about the emission.
About noise pollution.
And noise.
Air pollution.
And also safety.
Yeah, I think we have become so desensitized to vehicular oppression that we are kind of like, oh, they should have free reign, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
This was from an era where people were like, we have to be cautious around these things.
Yeah. I think also this does also reiterate the fact that this was, streets were public space, and we have moved away from that. Streets now are for cars by a lot of people's definition, when streets really should still be for people, but most places just cars have free reign, and that's just kind of the norm. And then the last point we'll touch on with the Locomotive Act was they had restrictions for weight, which is, again, they're concerned about their infrastructure, they're concerned about their roads of the time, because still there are...
cobblestone, right?
Yeah, honestly, a lot of dirt
places?
probably.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes cobblestone. It depends on where. This is the UK, but the road quality varied substantially. I will say I think the standards of roads probably changed quite a bit. Largely due to the fact that early cars were crude, and then also they started going a lot faster, so they're chattering like crazy, and they had limited suspension. So I think, ironically, we probably have much smoother roads because of the higher speeds that we've become accustomed to.
That's true.
So the limits were like 14 tons and 9 feet in width, which is frickin' huge.
Yeah.
But of course, as you can see from the footage we have of that puffing devil, it is basically a giant steam engine on big metal-plated wagon wheels. That is a reproduction that they've done, but it's like the gist of it is the same. It's a simple platform.
It's probably pretty faithful because there's not a ton of.
It's very low tech.
Room,
it's very steam punk aesthetic with the just big cauldron, big pressure pot. But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to think like this is well over 100 years ago now. We didn't even have near the technology or the speed capabilities, but still limiting speed further. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, a lot of things that we should continue to be concerned about, but have completely lost. And when people talk about the war on cars, I guess it is kind of one of those things where like we have made so many concessions on that we don't even realize that we like have to live within those constraints, right?
Well, I think the irony is
and I'm specifically referring to like the air pollution, the noise pollution, the safety, the weight, the speed, right?
Absolutely. And I think the thing is people like to frame it as the war on cars, but I think people have become kind of like desensitized to the fact that like early road use was like when cars began to dominate, it was the war on people basically. And we basically saw
people
advocacy.
Lost.
We saw advocacy groups just start funneling in and, just creating campaigns to basically limit people's ability to exist in the street. I think most people cite it in like the 1960s is when most cities and towns became fully invested and we saw the cars were the future. Therefore, limited maybe walkability. You're going to see sometimes suburban areas with not even a sidewalk. And a lot of that kind of tendency with just like road design and even just city and town design where it's like the pedestrian is secondary. It's not really a thought about thing.
That is literally like the criminalization of jaywalking again, right?
Yeah. So we're going to pivot a little bit now. And this is an article written by Christopher Loss, and this is called Danger and a Nuisance, Regulating the Automobile in Ontario, 1903 to 1912.
So we're bringing it home.
We're bringing it home. We're back to Canada now. And I think we're going to have a couple kind of quotes that we're going to talk about a little bit. And I think this one still rings true today, but I think a lot of people are in denial about. And it's that the car was also a symbol of division. It emphasized social gaps in wealth, lifestyle, geography, and community structure. Early automobile owners were almost exclusively high-income individuals, the only people capable of affording these complex new pieces of machinery. I will note, after a few years, car costs did come down substantially, and that obviously helped with its popularity immensely. But I think today, we have a lot of people, I've had this experience riding on the road, where people kind of insinuate you can't afford a car, that's why you're biking. Not because you've chosen a different mode of transport.
But there's also, because I am paying for a car, paying vehicle insurance, paying whatever, I deserve to be on the roads more than you do, even though we also pay into, as citizens of the city, our taxes go into maintaining the roadways. The
other reality is a lot of people overspend on their cars, and not by choice, really. It's kind of by necessity. They have to spend that money just because they live in a place that they don't have solutions that are viable for their mobility. And I think that's the most human thing, is to want to be able to have freedom of mobility. And it's a very grounding, good thing for both your physical and your mental health to be able to just to exit your house and not have to rely on literally good old dinosaur juice and combustion engines. So another couple quotes here. And I think this is interesting to kind of contextualize how in that early 1900s era, people were still really concerned and not really fully, I think, trusting of automobiles or any of these kind of motor vehicles we're seeing on the road.
Do you trust cars now when you're going past them? Every car I pass, I'm like, someone could be in there about to open the door.
Yeah, or just literally not stop.
Yeah.
Because even our right on red rule, most people don't even stop. And I know people like to point fingers at bikes, even though I see countless cars do this every day. And it's when I'm a pedestrian, I'm always is this person going to try to swing in front of me, or are they actually going to stop at this red light?
But the percentage slowdown when you are on a bicycle, and also contributing factors like your mass, your maximum speed. When I'm braking and I'm slowing down to slower than a walking speed at a stop sign, even if I don't put my foot down, that is a stop. That is a stop.
I agree. I am an advocate of the Idaho stop, which is, if you're not familiar, that is the stop and yield, or slow and yield. You stop if there is other traffic, but basically the rationale for that is that most motor control things, stop signs, traffic lights, are designed because traffic speed is too fast, and traffic speed does not yield well to other traffic. Like if you've ever experienced a power outage at a intersection, I'll give an example. Woodbine and Lakeshore.
Okay.
Or actually, sorry, Coxwell and Lakeshore, rather.
Right.
Coxwell and Lakeshore.
Mentally, I'm there.
Mentally down there now. Down there, there's that Ashbridges Bay skate park, and I was driving home once. I had borrowed my parents' car. I think I was moving at the time, and I was trying to just return it, and the lights were out. And I'm very familiar with this area, but people just full speed, and I was like, someone is going to get T-boned at this rate, because the lights, like, not only are the street lights out, but the traffic lights are out, and people aren't even pretending to slow down or experience this. I'm like, everyone knows there's a light here. You need to treat an out traffic light at least like a stop sign.
Yeah.
Just like a stop sign. It's a little hard at this wide, like a super wide road that is relatively fast, but like that is a case, an example why you need you need to actually have traffic lights, because cars are dangerous without them.
Yeah. Well, like I say, traffic laws are for when there's traffic. If there's no traffic, then, like, you don't need to come to a full and complete stop.
Yeah.
Just for the, like, pageantry of it, right?
So, back to our quote. Many groups and individuals pressured their legislators to regulate the car, and there was rarely a legislative session between 1903 and 1912 that did not debate automobile regulation in some form. So, again, I think this is a perfect example. Like, we're showing just over 100 years ago, people are still worried about cars regulating, and earlier, even then, we're talking about emissions, we're talking about noise, we're talking about speed. And then this is, I think, another great example here in this quote. In the first decade of the 20th century, legislative intent, public opinion, and judicial interpretation were all neatly aligned against the interest of the automobile owner. So, just to segue quickly.
So what does that mean? Does that mean, like, legally, we were trying to protect ourselves from cars as much as we possibly could?
Yeah. So part of this was also the owners of vehicles were often held accountable regardless of who was driving, because as we were discussing about the
so is it like my 10-year-old stole my car and drove through a playground?
Well, it wouldn't have been that at the era. It wouldn't have been that in this era. But what it would be is, because this was a societal gap, and usually these well-to-do people could afford a chauffeur. It wasn't like I'm driving. It's like I pay someone to drive. They're my servant, and they're driving me around town.
But as the owner of the car, you are the
As the owner of the car,
yeah.
you are legally, basically, it's like, this is your liability, this vehicle is dangerous, and everyone was kind of aligned on that. Probably not the owners of the car, because they were the minority at the time, and the status quo was basically the people who are wary of the car. So, basically, if you had a chauffeur, they drop you off, they go for a little joyride, they pick up some friends and are showing off their fancy motor vehicle and get into an accident, they would often actually be fining or trying the actual owner of the vehicle, not necessarily the chauffeur. So the segue now, and this is a little bit dark, so we're going to skim over this because this is frankly a bummer. And this is a couple examples of what the minimum and maximum fines are in Ontario for careless driving causing death or bodily harm. Court-imposed penalty for careless driving causing death, bodily harm are as follows: a minimum fine of $2,000. Up to a maximum fine of $50,000, custodial jail sentence not exceeding 2 years, and or up to 5-year Ontario driver license suspension.
The difference between $2,000 and $50,000 is really big. And like when you say like, oh, the value of a human life is between those figures, it's like pretty bananas, right?
Yeah. And then final point would be the demerit points, so 6 demerit points, which I forget exactly how those break down because I've never had a demerit point. But it's kind of a striking and like sad thing when you realize this is including death, not just bodily harm. So you could either end someone's life or completely alter the future of their existence, and it could just be $2,000 and a suspension. This is I think where it really frustrates me, because because as a society we have become so dependent on cars, we see like no license as in like it's like a death sentence. You can't take someone's license away, because some people exist in spaces where they need to actually drive to get around, which is frankly unfortunate. I feel bad for those people.
But that's just...
But again, if you cause bodily harm to someone and drastically alter the course of their life, maybe you as the perpetrator of this road violence, maybe you should feel a little more accountable, and maybe you need to alter the course of your life to get around without a car.
I think it's just like wrong that people should be locked into driving when they don't want to. A lot of people don't want to drive. A lot of people, I should say, don't enjoy driving. They don't find it pleasant. They find it to be a negative experience overall, and they don't want to do it. So if you don't want to drive, you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't be forced to drive or risk being like at the behest of a very deeply flawed transit system, or like, you know, at the risk of having violence inflicted on you by drivers, right?
Yeah. Because
like when I choose to cycle, I'm kind of like, you know, at the mercy of motorists, right? It shouldn't have to be that is your only option.
It's true. I think one thing I think about often is the amount of subsidy and propaganda we see promoting driving as if it's this source of freedom. And the irony, I think you were mentioning the other day about the off-road vehicle ad trying to show a sporty lifestyle. And what were they driving to get to?
They there was this advert I saw where they had these sport utility vehicles that they were taking off-road to go, and then like they arrived at their destination and they took bikes out of their cars to go bike.
But I think it's so ironic is basically they're now trying to co-opt the freedom you experience and the like joy of cycling, and now they're like, let's make this actually...
Look how you have to drive there. You can have so much... And they don't show the traffic leading up to the cycling spot.
It's conveniently completely omitted in all the traffic.
Yeah,
or all
it's like you're the
ads.
only person on the road. You can go any
freedom of the
speed
open
you
road.
want.
What open road? We have some of the worst traffic in the world here in Toronto. There is no open road. It's constant gridlock. And I think
you have to endure it to go enjoy some cycling.
And this is, I think, the funny irony of driving is... and I've joked that I think this would kill the experience of driving in the city, is if cars actually, like a cycle computer, had an average speed. Because they don't show average speed. You get the false sense of, I'm going fast. So people drive like maniacs, full tilt to a stop sign, and then they sit in traffic as you just tool by on your bike for probably the actual same average speed, because you're catching them at every single light without barely breaking a sweat off, and you're just riding at a slow, casual pace.
Like, that experience is so common. It's not even like an outlier. It's not like exciting anymore. It really is like, I think the average speed that cars travel in Toronto is around 11 kilometers per hour.
Yeah.
Which is slower than I travel on my bike.
Yeah. And I mean, I often compare. I mean, I don't think Google's perfect for this, but I often do a back and forth. And so I was like, I do have a car. I have that option sometimes. I'm only going to usually choose the car if I am carrying something beyond what my normal bike can't handle, or even sometimes my bike trailer can't handle, right? So if I'm within the city limits and not going to somewhere where we see a drastic increase in like potential speed, and I'm talking highway, but it would only work off-peak hours, because the time you always want to go is when everyone else wants to go. Therefore, it's a complete moot point. There's no point in getting on the highway to just sit and like barely go 40 kilometers an hour sometimes and then grind to a halt right after.
A lot of driving is remaining a lot more stationary than you would on a bike, for sure.
But I think that's the thing is we have to make cars these like comfortable living rooms of spaces where it's like it's noise reduction, because you don't want to hear all the other cars idling around you. Temperature controlled. You know, you have this, you basically feel at home and relaxed, which I think is ironically what you shouldn't want when you're actively going and moving around in a large, potentially dangerous vehicle. But I digress. We're going to talk now a little bit about jaywalking.
But do you think people should be uncomfortable in cars? Do you think they should have spiky seats?
I mean, I think it's
like
just
a wooden chair?
People feel like it's an office, you know, and I see so many people just like, oh, I'm bored now because nothing's happening. Let me pull out my phone, and then they don't go when they're supposed to. They go sporadically. They look up, they panic, and I just see so many dangerous potential.
I'd rather that people were stopped while they were using it, rather than like some
I agree.
people that I have seen where they have like the phone in the hand, while they're operating the vehicle.
But the thing
right?
is most people do operate at a stop, but they don't finish what they're doing because they can't be alone with their own thoughts for more than 30 seconds. So one traffic light isn't enough time to do anything meaningful on a phone.
Yeah.
So then they continue to drive with one hand and just kind of barely looking, not really paying attention. And it's such a preventable, easy... So, excuse me, sir. We're busy here. Get out of here. Get out.
He was going to come up and sit with us.
He was going to sit with us. No, thank you.
Really?
And-
I would have loved that.
Well, he'll probably
Have
chew
him
your
try
wire.
I don't want him to chew my wire.
So we're going to talk a little bit about jaywalking. And if you don't already know about the history of jaywalking, I think it's a very interesting, but also kind of bleak.
Yeah, we
bleak
did touch on
space.
this like for a hot second.
We've
at the
kind of
beginning.
we've kind of alluded to this, but basically this is kind of what made me want to like research a little about the early days of cars, because clearly there was like some strong groups basically pushing for car rights in the early days. So this is a little more centered around the U.S., but it carries over the border. It's become kind of an international thing. So this is an
you
excerpt.
can say jaywalking anywhere in this world. People won't be like, oh, what's that?
Yeah. And I personally, for the record, I don't agree with it. But I have been conditioned to say it. And I slip out and say jaywalking, even though it's like, I don't think there's actually anything wrong with jaywalking as long as it's being done safely. Like when traffic's not moving, you shouldn't be criminalized for, hey, I'm walking through stationary traffic to cross the street.
Have you ever been crossing and there has been a gap between the cars that you have walked casually between and they begin inching forward even though there's
Yeah.
no movement?
Yeah.
I think that is the cruelest thing
Well, I
you
think-
can do to someone. Well, not the cruelest thing. Like,
No, but it just shows a lack of compassion. And
Yeah.
someone is basically irritated that you're able to move freely past them when they're stuck and stationary. And they're just showing that contempt and that kind of like weird animosity from like, it's like an us versus them principle.
it's the need to get in front mentality. You don't have to get anywhere. You don't have to get in front of me when you're not moving. It's okay to just like let people pass by.
I do find a lot of car drivers do have a bit of tunnel vision, and they don't look up and see a light, and they don't see it's red, you know,
Right,
and they
right,
don't like think like why am I rushing to a red light? Like why wouldn't I would gladly let people behind as long as I'm not stopping traffic actively to let someone like go in front of me or turn in front of me or you know. All right, so we're gonna talk a little bit about jaywalking and. Specifically, there's a little article here written by Michael Lewyn in 2017 called The Criminalization of Walking. And we're going to be mainly talking about the history of jaywalking, which is taken from this section. Until the 1920s, streets were not just for cars, but for walkers as well, and children routinely played in the streets.
Radical.
In the 1920s, however, fast cars began to threaten this status quo. During that decade, over 200,000 Americans were killed in traffic accidents. In cities, 3/4 of these victims were pedestrians. At first, public officials were sometimes willing to blame drivers for collisions with walkers. In 1923, one safety expert explained that juries in accident cases involving a motorist and pedestrian almost invariably give the pedestrian the benefit of the doubt. One Philadelphia judge lectured drivers in his courtroom, prophetically expressing concern that it won't be long before children won't have any rights at all in the streets. Some states responded with lower speed limits. Because these speed limits were unenforceable, most American police chiefs favored laws requiring automobile manufacturers to limit vehicle speed through speed governors. So,
I think my first thing is like, you know, when you hear people being like, oh, you don't see kids playing in the streets anymore. It's like, my brother in Christ, look at the streets.
yeah, kids don't play outside. And when you think,
between
what
the
are the
stranger
dangers? What are the dangers? There's a stranger danger, but the stranger danger thing, I think, is also like...
Well, that's a moral panic.
It's a moral...
not-
It is a moral panic, but I think the reality is for most people, even in a closed, safe community, you know all your neighbors, the number one danger is motor vehicles at this point. And I think it's interesting to see other countries, how they handled this. Like some places, like Amsterdam, that in the 60s, they were doing the same thing that most American cities were doing. They're investing similarly in cars. They were, making large freeways. Unsurprisingly, they had an uptick in child death in streets from road violence or car accidents, we historically have called these.
But they took the radical stance that children should not die.
Yeah, but basically,
Like-
we saw public campaigns moving against motor vehicles and asking for alternatives. And it's ironic now to look, and that's always, well, look what we could have. And people are like, oh, we can't do that. Well, they did it. It's just we waited kind of too long. So it's really hard to have these discussions because then people frame things as, oh, it's the war on cars. There are still cars there. Cars are still valid. Cars can still fit into a greater mobility and transit solution. It's just we are so like ridiculously invested in cars. When you talk about alternates to cars, people think you're fundamentally against cars. I've said it again. I'm a car owner. I use transit. I use trains. I use bikes. My number one choice is usually going to be bikes if I'm in the city because it's just the most sensible thing. Like, the traffic is out of control. I'm also just, like, it feels like it's faster. When you actually do the math, it's often slower for small distance. I have a car to leave the city, and even then is frustratingly slow because of all the traffic.
But it's also about having the freedom to choose to take which.
Yeah,
if you're locked into only being able to drive.
And frankly, if I had access to better regional transit, like more regularly, more active, that would be probably my number one choice. I'd rather do a mixed modal transit situation than actually take a car most of the time. But the way we have set up our society is so car-centric, it's very hard to do certain things. And we've talked to, some of our customers and folks in the community about, like, oh, they don't own a car, they use a cargo bike. And what do they do? They just rent a car. You rent a car. Yeah. You may have a car, you may rent a car.
And they choose not to use it.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's this kind of, tendency that people think that these things all can't kind of work together. And I think they are not in opposition.
That's a car mindset.
That is a car.
It's
us versus them. And I think this also comes the car. I would just describe this as a car mindset. It's us versus them, because you always hear, "Oh, cyclists never," and then you hear a thing, and then I'm like, okay,
you guys don't stop.
So it's like it's always the stop sign.
Yeah.
It's like, you don't stop at stop. There are places that do have that legal. It's not legal here. Similarly, pardon me. Similarly, cars don't stop at most stop signs. They do a rolling stop, which would be an Idaho stop on a bike, but they're supposed to stop. But similarly, cars can turn right here on a red, and you're supposed to stop at a red first. If it's clear, you can go. Most cars don't do that. They just turn right and swing hard. I'll find lots of clips of this. Don't worry. We'll show so many clips of it. But
even if it is no right turn on red, there are often going to be cars that will begin closing in on your space. Like, let's say there's a cycle lane there while the light is still red anyway, because they're like, I'm going to turn, I'm going to do it. And it's like, well, I'm going to travel straight. Maybe don't cut me off while we're at a red.
The way I like to describe the streetscape now is basically there's limited enforcement, and most people aren't following the rules. They do whatever they want all the time, which makes it chaotic. It makes traffic worse. I'm not going to sit here and point fingers and act like everyone's wrong, or like, so I am saying everyone's wrong, but like, I'm not going to try to make it individual groups. I think it's very easy if you are only existing in one group, like, I'm only a car driver, therefore everyone else is, you're just selectively seeing certain things in front of you, but you're not watching the cars, because when the cars are flying around that red light doing a right-hand turn, they're getting out of your way faster. You're not able to perceive them as long,
But I think also, like, jaywalking is proof of why we can't enforce our way or, like, police our way out of, like, this situation, is because we have to just, like, be cognizant that we are sharing the space with other people, and that is a lot harder to do when you're in an enclosed vehicle.
Yeah. Shall I continue?
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna read a little more.
About jaywalking.
I know we get a little off the rails when we start talking about jaywalking, because I also
a symbol of, like, the thing that is wrong, like the propaganda of it, like.
Yeah. So rather than tolerating such measures, the auto industry and its allies sought to drive pedestrians off the streets. As part of this propaganda campaign, the automobile lobby used the term jaywalker. The term jay originally meant a country hayseed out of place in the city. Thus, a jaywalker was a pedestrian out of place in the city, one oblivious to the dangers of motor traffic. Automobile lobbyists and lobby-influenced safety groups use this term to stigmatize walkers.
See how they're already planting the seeds of motonormativity? Like, if you are walking, you are out of place in the city, because the city is for cars. The streets are for cars. You're out of place there.
It's kind of one of those things, like, it's kind of fascinating to me too. Like, here they have safety groups in quotes, because it's kind of a diabolical thing they did there. Like, they infiltrated in such a clever way. We have some examples here. Maybe I'll reel those out and we'll talk a little about it. So here's some examples of these influences, they lobbied and kind of manipulated the public. In Los Angeles, an automobile club posted signs warning jaywalking was prohibited, even though at the time this term was not in the city's traffic code. So they're just kind of making stuff up at this point. They created a term and they just go off with it. In some cities, auto lobbyists use their advertising power to take over the press. For example, in 1923, the Chicago Motor Club bought space in the Chicago Tribune for advertisements, claiming that pedestrians cause 90% of auto collisions, which is wild. And I think
are they pedestrian collisions or are they auto collisions? Yeah. What's causing them?
I like though at least they don't. They don't call it an accident here. They're not dancing around hard. But again, this is
accident does imply it's like a little oopsie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Auto lobbyists also hijacked public education using peer pressure to influence students. For example, in 1925, a student jury in a Detroit public school tried a fellow student for jaywalking. Hello.
Hi.
Sentencing the defendant to wash school blackboards for a week. And then finally, we have the Chicago Taxi Cab Company president, John Hertz, asserted, "We fear the jaywalker worse than the anarchist." So you can kind of see this like...
They're indoctrinating these children to police each other.
Yeah. So first they just make up the term. They promote the term. So they're just...
Who do you think that kid was? Imagine like, I'm going to school one day and all of your peers are like, did you just cross the street at not a crosswalk?
Yeah.
People are talking about it like 100 years later.
It's literally like classic propaganda. They just turned the student body against this one person.
Yeah.
We'll show them. Here's the scapegoat. Get him. Clean the blackboards. How much do you want to bet?
Yeah, but we're still talking about it.
How much do you want to bet he was a minority?
Oh, or like just a weird kid that no one liked, and then they were like, "Oh,
yeah, he'll be the
here's
scapegoat.
our chance to be really
Yeah, he always crosses diagonally at that intersection."
Yeah.
Anyways, but I think you can see this kind of...
What year was this?
This was 1920 to 1920. That was the specific child example, 1925. So 99 years ago today.
Yeah, literally 100 years later, we're like, this kid crossed.
Yeah, it's honestly weird. It's wild because they basically made up a term, presented it, promoted it through literally advertising the space. And I think the kid example, it kind of like hits different, even though it's like, oh, they made you wash a blackboard. Not the end of the world. But it sticks with you. You like probably traumatized this kid because aligning the student body against some kid, literally, it's like a weird manipulative way to just like turn the student body against one individual who probably...
And all these students are like, it is right to do this. I feel so good right now persecuting this one individual. This
and
rules.
Now people still echo this 100 years later. They're still saying, oh, you're jaywalking. Mm-hmm. And it's like a way to basically turn people on themselves. And then we're not talking about like, this is no longer about safety. This is about just like, again, it's car dominance, which is, I think, the like scary undertone. It's the guise of safety, but the reality is the danger is cars. People kind of weren't oblivious to cars were dangerous, but it was like, you need to get out of the way because these brakes don't work and this just goes fast, is the energy they're giving.
I think policing jaywalking is kind of like a gateway drug to policing loitering, to policing like encampment residents.
Yeah.
Like it's all just the criminalization of existing in public outside of a vehicle or a house or whatever.
Well, I think that's what's also kind of wild about this is like, it's like, I think people have begun to see like being a proactive member of society is existing within a car.
Yeah.
And in my experience, when people have issue with you on a bike and start to like talk to you, they talk down to you because it becomes a class thing. It's about taxes and it's about MySpace and it's like people have this personal like it's public space and we forget that. And I mean we've talked.
There's also social stratification within cyclists, right? Like leisure cyclists versus commuting cyclists.
Yeah. But I think for a lot of people, they just lump that whole thing together.
I mean, we are all the enemy of the car at the end of the day. Well. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
That stratification continues to exist on a lot of levels.
So we'll continue a little to keep things moving. Ultimately, auto lobbyists persuaded governments to supplement industry propaganda with state coercion. In Los Angeles, the Automobile Club created a coalition called the Los Angeles Traffic Commission, which drafted a model traffic ordinance that included anti-jaywalking provisions. The city council passed the ordinance in 1925. Violators were fined or even arrested. Other cities quickly followed suit. And today, jaywalking jaywalking is almost universally prohibited in the United States. So, and this is 1925. So you can see in basically like 1920s, they were, you know, saying, oh, this is, don't jaywalk. And that's just like, they're putting up arbitrary signs that they've then influenced the public opinion through campaigning. And then they have these mock trials with children. And that same year, they passed the ordinance to make it illegal. So they basically played out the whole thing and paid for it. And then we're just like, now it's illegal pretty well across the United States.
They succeeded.
Yeah.
Another L.
Like, it's honestly, that is
team anti-car.
kind of a terrifying turn of events, where it's like, and this is, I think, where, like, when I first learned about this, it blew my mind, because I was thinking, like, yeah, streets are public space. They should be public space. Why do we have not enough public space? There's not enough public space here, even though it's like, we're in a big park. It's like, there's so many people coming to this. And of course, we're completely surrounded by a wall of cars. Like, literally, all of my line of sight, any way I turn, almost entirely, unless I look out to the water where I see boats, it's all cars moving nonstop.
But that is just another way that Toronto has fucked up their waterfront, right? Like,
it's a highway.
Yeah.
And not even a good one. The final note I'm going to make here, I shouldn't say the note. This is just quoting again, but I think we've already touched on this.
The final quote.
Jaywalking laws, like anti-loitering laws and other rarely enforced legislation, may also be selectively enforced against unpopular minorities. For example, police sometimes target racial minorities and use the homeless, for jaywalking citations. In Ferguson, Missouri, police used jaywalking tickets to punish black walkers the police perceived as insufficiently respectful of police authority. In the 1970s, decades later now, police routinely stood outside Denver's most popular gay and lesbian bar and issued jaywalking citations. So this is, again, just police don't like you. This is just a new way they can basically criminalize you for existing and moving through space.
They've codified the ability to bully people.
Yeah.
Through jaywalking, through loitering, whatever. Why are you standing there? Why are you walking there? You can't even move through a space without getting...
I think this, like, that, I think hammers home how kind of dystopian this law is. Or it's not always law, but I think this tendency, and like even the tendency of people wanting to police other people's behavior in public, and like other people walking are going to be like, don't jaywalk. I was taught not to jaywalk as a child, which is good for safety. Like,
with the verbiage of jaywalking.
Basically, don't go in the street. But
it should be don't cross the street without looking both ways, without making sure that you're in a safe spot to cross. But instead, it is like summarized as like, do not jaywalk, right? But that in itself is like fallacious.
Yeah, it makes me kind of sad to think about. I think the other thing about like the kind of pay to play mentality of like using the streets for motor vehicle traffic, you have to pay insurance, you got to pay your gas, you got to pay your vehicle payments. So many people are extending themselves beyond their means, and still it is this still like class based thing in a way. And then you as a walker are looked down upon because you're not paying your fair share to exist here, therefore you're not allowed. And we were even talking about like how much public space is used for parking. Like, yes. You pay the city, but you pay a comically small amount for this parking space in a city. And you just have to
store your private property.
You have to
on
prove
this
your
public
residence.
Space.
So you have to be a paying person, but then you can store this large thing full of your crap in a public roadway, which is, I think, it's like, and people, again, see it as a right. It's not a privilege. They're like, I pay for this. I'm entitled to it.
Yeah.
This is my space. And sometimes people, you see weird stories online of people like, don't park in front of my house on the street because that's my parking space. It's like, it's not. You pay for just general street parking.
Yeah.
You have a whole area you're allowed to park in. So I think some of this energy too, we do see echoing in this kind of isolating tendency in a car where we, while you walk around, you are engaging with your community versus most cars and most traffic is single occupancy. So it's not only like already like an isolating experience, but like you're just kind of forced into this like dehumanizing little bubble. And I think a lot of people don't think about the negative repercussions of that on your mental health, to just be constantly just isolating yourself and just feeling alone within this space. And I think it's got the easiest cure ever. It's just like literally get out of your car and walk around your community for once. Sorry. Just watch that squirrel run for its life and this dog is just sniffing it out.
Hi, it's up the tree.
It's right there.
It's up the tree.
You're too slow. He's having such a time. I think the other thing we've also touched on before is, like, I think it's the most human experience to want to have freedom of movement. And I think there's always this pushback from car users with the idea of a 15-minute city. And if you're not familiar with what a 15-minute city is, it's basically the logic of, like, having access not dependent on a long car trip within, like, 15 minutes of your house. Like, you should be able to basically buy the essentials for you to exist within a small area.
I think that's a reasonable, like, people are fearful of the 15-minute city, and I don't really get why.
Yeah,
like,
and it's presented in a negative light, and I'm like, you want to sit in traffic to go get, like, groceries every day?
Yeah.
Or, like, at least once a week? Like, it's like the Costco experience. Like, I want to go to a giant emporium with just, like, all the things in too much quantity that I can't physically carry myself. It doesn't quite make sense. It's a little backwards. And I think the funny thing is we talk about, like, freedom of mobility. What about for people that can't drive cars?
But I have never seen a Costco load that you could not physically carry in a cargo bike. I'm very serious here.
It's true. And I think that is where, like, a cargo bike is an interesting parallel or, like, alternate to a car. Because it's funny, talking with cargo bike owners, I've heard numerous citations of the Costco run experience on a cargo bike, or even just with a trailer, just a literal cargo trailer. Hey, a couple $100 for that cargo trailer, you can still go to Costco.
And I gotta say, it feels so amazing to carry an IKEA load on a conventional bicycle with no trailer. I really feel like a superhero.
Yeah. But getting back to the 15-minute cities, is like, those who either cannot legally drive, like children, people below the age of 16,
or people who should not be
driving anymore, who are elderly, who, that's often like, oh, how can they get around? And you see, like, some, places, they're like, oh, we designed this fake town that's super tiny for people with Alzheimer's, so they can just wander around
and
safely.
You can see how
it's like, why wouldn't you just want that town?
For their mental wellness is, like, to be able to go around and have people be understanding and
engage
and talk to them
and
in
not
a
have
kind,
cars
gentle
rip
way.
through.
Like,
but, like, basically it's like you want a community like that, where it's like someone who is elderly should be able to have a small walk, light exercise, do some errands, and sustain themselves. And also that keeps you mentally sharp. Like, if you actually are living in a condo somewhere, going down an elevator, and then just driving out, doing your thing, driving home, and
you
schlepping
get none
stuff.
of the positive effects of socialization.
Yeah, you're literally just passing by people and not able to interact in a positive space. And probably, let's be honest, if you're on the, the tail end of your driving career, we'll say, you might not be the best at it anymore, and you're probably, like, it's probably stressful.
You might have peed.
You may have had some instances of not, doing the best job at your thing anymore. And I think that's the other thing about, like, I'm not sure how it is other places, but I found it kind of frightening. I got my license when I was in my early 20s, because I had no reason to get a license before that. I biked everywhere, and I was like, I don't want to have the burden of driving all the time, and I didn't really need it.
Did you do your test in Toronto?
I did. Yeah, I did it just East End, Toronto.
Because I was thinking about these people who say, like, oh, you should go do your test out in buttfuck nowhere. And it's like, why would I want to learn to drive in a place where I'm not going to be driving?
Yeah, I am firmly opposed to that, because that basically just encourages people who are unqualified to pass the driving test. And that's a low bar already. It's like, if you can't pass the test where you're going to exist and be manipulating a vehicle, you shouldn't be getting it at all. But basically, there's no refresh. There's no... like, hey, it's been a decade since you took this test. Like I don't think that's a bad thing, because...
Well, you have to renew your first aid every 2 to 3 years, but you can drive.
You can just drive through walls endlessly.
To 75, as long as you haven't killed too many people.
Well, you may have a little break there when you get a few demerit points and have a little short suspension,
for like
but
a
you
year,
can get it back.
1 to 5 years.
Yeah. So I think what's kind of scary is we basically wait till it's too late. Like, I don't think you actually have to retest till, like, you're beyond, like, 80 or something. Which,
I think that is correct,
yeah. So they're just making sure your mental faculties, your stuff is all good then. But, like, you basically get it, a lot of people get it when they're 16, and they can go decades over decades over decades over decades of driving without any retest. And just, like, yeah, they may get pulled over if they're egregious, but we don't see a lot of enforcement, period, on the streets anymore. And I think, especially now more than ever, where we are seeing new things. We're seeing separated bike lanes, different types of infrastructure. We should be having refreshers. We should be training people how to navigate this stuff who are the driving public.
Well, I think it's a pretty low bar to be like, you should not drive your car across a curb into separated cycling infrastructure and park there.
Yeah.
And yet, you should not try and destroy all of the reflective bollards.
Yeah.
And yet... Normalize the Dutch reach before opening your car. I was, I think I told you this story already, but I was riding on the bike lane, and someone opened their door, whoom, like out towards me, and I dodged it, but I screamed because I had to jerk my bars, and then the person in the car also screamed, so we were just both like
screaming.
Yeah. And we passed each other, but it was like, damn. We connected in that moment,
you know,
and it was because they scared me.
That might be a little bit of a wake up for them. Hopefully,
I hope so.
Hopefully, they weren't just mad at you for existing and being in the same space as them.
We'll never know. I did not stop to say I apologize for screaming, and they did not say I apologize for opening my door at you. But that's why cycling infrastructure, like wide cycling infrastructure, is good, because I had room to move out of the way instead of just being locked in. Often, like, you know, when you're on college near where you are.
Yep.
Okay, doxing Owen's house.
In Little Italy.
Yeah, but like where the bike lane disappears and there is parking on the right and then traffic on your left. If someone opens your door, you can't dodge it like that.
No, there's not a lot of space.
Or even with the streetcar tracks.
I tend to take the lane often there. Yeah, especially during cafe.
I just go really slow.
Yeah, either or. I'll go slow or I'll take the lane. But it's you're kind of forced into that when you're outside of bike infrastructure. I think that's also...
I feel no guilt about going like 6 kilometers an hour.
That's a huge thing about the accessibility of a bike lane, though. It's because you're not forced into, you need to go take the lane, go full speed and try to catch up with traffic, or like go weirdly slow to avoid potential doorings. You know, that's why we need infrastructure. It's just like, basically, you shouldn't be punished for, you know, the lack of safety in your, you know, vicinity.
Our sidewalks are also not wide enough. Like, why I like having a separated bike lane at grade with the sidewalk is because if I see someone with a motorized, scooter or like some other mobility device using the lane with me, I don't feel a single thing, because we do not have enough sidewalk space.
Yeah. Especially with all the stuff they put on the sidewalk, because if you imagine like
patio furniture,
like you have
signage,
so much infrastructure stuff. You have
street furniture,
bus stops,
trees,
bus shelters too.
And those are things
also,
we want to
planters.
have there.
These are all things that should be nice and should be there. But when you crowd all of that, especially in a place that also experiences snow, it's like when you actually get an extreme weather, it's like sometimes I've actually walked through Little Italy where there's literally just like basically 1 foot width of walking, and like, there's someone coming at me, and I'm literally going like tiptoeing like I'm on a tightrope to get through this because no one cleared their fair share of the sidewalk.
If we get rid of that parking lane.
Yeah, so I think basically what we're getting at is we're happy to see that infrastructure is growing in Toronto. There is an effort. I think many people misconstrue this as a war on cars. This is a war against congestion, really, is what it is. We're trying to find solutions to not have basically people stuck in traffic all the time, and to propose safe, viable alternates. You know, you can look at micromobility. We might use language
like war on cars as in jest,
yes,
but like in reality, it is like the cars possessive war on people.
And I think, so the other thing I think about often is we're talking about 100 years ago, and I think a really funny...
which is relatively recent in the grand scheme of things, right?
Well, red-tailed hawk just swooped in. Anyways.
It's coming for the squirrel.
So we're talking about 100 years ago, and I'm kind of joking about, you know, dinosaur juice with cars, yada, you know. But, like, we've invested so heavily in this type of technology that is quite archaic, and it is, frankly, just, like, become the norm. It's the status quo now. It's what everyone does. It's expected that you drive. It's kind of weird if you don't by our, you know, cultural standards. But if you think about 100 years ago, we were seeing cigarette ads with doctors vouching for how good these cigarettes were. And this is at the same time we're lobbying against people existing in space. It's in people's best interest for you to not be healthy and to have to drive. And like back then they're even like, you should smoke too, it'll be great for you. But like no one's second guessing that for years. Eventually people are like, maybe this isn't the best things for public health. And now we have you know, limited measures of advertising, you have, you don't have like a big
The
glamorous
warning
wall.
labels
You have
on
warning
the
labels. We have all
box.
this stuff because, and I think the parallel of like emissions, it's like, this is not good for public health to exist around
I
this
was
stuff.
gonna say, I believe that like the amount of exhaust we breathe in is probably equivalent to like
Oh,
smoking
it's
a
terrible.
pack a day.
It's awful. And
Yeah.
it's just like, it's funny because people just don't want to talk about it. But then people who do want to talk about it are often like, oh, well, EVs will save us. It's just kind of more of the same thing because it's only one
That's
aspect.
reinforcing car supremacy to continue pushing into like, we have to have cars, and we acknowledge that like smoking is bad, so we should all vape.
Yeah, I know. The other aspect too, I think I personally find like if you're not already familiar of SUVs, that's a loophole as well. SUVs, remember when they're all flipping over and it was all dangerous? That's because they're classified as a light truck and we just dance around regulations. We did at one point try to regulate cars into being smaller and safer for everyone, including pedestrians, if there are collisions or accidents where, a car strikes a person walking. And the whole point of that is a lower hood. But now we see cars getting bigger, wider, heavier, EVs even bigger and heavier often.
People do that out of a fear for their own safety, and
Yeah.
they're like, I need to get there's a spider on a hat.
Oh, where?
I need to get a bigger car so
It's
that
an
I
arms
can be
race.
safe, right?
It's literally an arms
Yeah.
race. It's like we just keep going bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah,
and
where
it's
does
like,
it stop?
Where does it stop? We have limited space in cities. I know some people are like, oh, well, I need my truck for my, country living. Sure, you can make that argument, but we don't
Meredith
need
was
to.
saying
We don't
she
need to
carries-
accommodate that size of vehicle in a city center just because you live in a space outside and you want to have this like full right to the city that you don't even reside in.
Meredith was saying like she carries her hockey equipment in her cargo bike
Yeah,
easily,
absolutely.
and her 2 kids, and her grocery. Like, there are ways to get around that don't involve relying on cars.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the bottom line, is it's not necessarily car-free. You do hear lots of car-free rhetoric, and I think that is important because we need to play in extremes to counteract this absolute absurd
The other
extreme we've gone to.
extreme, yeah.
Yeah, and I think by doing that, you will eventually get to a middle ground. So when you have people adopting cargo bikes instead of cars and say, hey, I'd rather have 2 cargo bikes than a single car or a cargo bike and a car, because it just makes more sense. And when you need a car, you just rent one. There are so many different solutions, and I think it's like people need to see other people's example of like existing in a city without having to basically be on the hook for making car payments they may not actually need, and basically being strung along by a big car. Anyways, I think we're getting into now we're conspiracy theory time. Let's talk more. I think that kind of wraps up what we're getting at, is we have kind of gone to this extreme where we're completely 180 from what we originally believed. Like, public space should be public and for all, not just for someone who pays for a car. And I think it's a sad reality we live in where that's become the norm. But I think we need people to open their eyes and think about alternates to travel and kind of the joy that you can experience by just like existing in your community, not just ripping through it. So, what do you think? Do you agree? Do you think we need more bike lanes? I think that's kind of a given. But I think a lot of people don't think about, the negative effects of a car has on their personal experience. Not only their personal finances, but their personal,
Everything.
Everything. Like, there are so many negatives to a car. I'm surprised more people aren't suspicious of how hard they have to try to sell them to us repeatedly. Like, that's probably the most popular ad you see. Print ads, radio ads. Like, I'm on YouTube. It's just like, car ads. Turn on a TV. It's car ads. And it's like, I don't want those cars.
And something else I want to add, like, we are not academics. We're not urban infrastructure PhDs. We're just people who like bikes. We're people who like getting around.
I'm a
and
mixed mode enjoyer, actually. I like everything that's not a car.
Well, I care
accept
about
that
my
car-
ability to get around and other people's ability
Yeah.
to get around. And I think sometimes we see drivers caring just about the former. They don't care about
Yeah.
other people's ability to get around,
Yeah.
right?
Or they see like it's infringing on their way to get around by other people having freedom of mobility.
Yeah, you might have more insights than us.
Yeah.
Maybe, probably. Honestly, it's very likely. But you can also feel free to share them. And
Yeah.
it's important to talk about these things.
I'm optimistic, though. I think the city is at least starting to do
Yeah.
what is needed. We're seeing bike lanes go in. Well, I think the concern at this point, though, is we also are seeing the provincial government may be potentially affecting our ability as a city to govern ourselves and to say, hey, this is what we need.
Well, yeah, they are using. I hope this does not pass, right? Like criminalizing the construction of new bike lanes as a way to control the number of people who will be riding. It really just means that you're pushing cyclists into the car lane, which if you give a shit about how fast you're traveling, do you want to be stuck behind me, the slow, horrible bike? You want to be traveling in your car lane.
Exactly.
Give me the bike lane.
One thing I think is kind of ironic about that new proposed legislation is the amount of times we are willing to close lanes of traffic or like sidewalks or bike lanes for literal condo construction. Like, why is that not illegal? Well, I guess it is illegal. It's just they pay enough to exist there, and they're like, this is good for the. This is good because there's enough money changing hands. Everyone's happy.
With those things, it is typically that they remove the pedestrian space, the sidewalk. They say pedestrians use other sidewalk, and often it'll be like right in between like these major lights where you have to travel like another 10-15 minutes around to get back to where you want to get.
Like, why don't you just close the street entirely and just say cars go somewhere else?
Yeah, why not?
Taste your own medicine. How about that? How you like that? All right. Anyways, I think we're done here.
That's enough.
Thanks so much for watching.
Thank
and
you.
if you enjoy this type of content or you want to get involved in the conversation, please share your thoughts in the comments. And please like and subscribe if you want to see more. And if you want to suggest future topics for Bike Banter, maybe you want to join the conversation, let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, you could be sitting right here.
You could be right here with us. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.